June 1944. The dense, suffocating jungles of Burma. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves mixing with the sharp metallic temps of blood. Above the thick canopy, the distant rumble of artillery echoed like thunder rolling across the sky. But on the ground, the battle was not fought with tanks or bombers. Instead, it was a brutal, silent war fought at close range, with blade against body. The Gurkha riflemen, armed with nothing but their infamous kukri knives, moved like shadows through the underbrush. Their footsteps soft, deliberate. For the Japanese soldiers, who had come to fear the Gurkhas almost as much as the British guns themselves, the jungle had become a realm of terror. In the eyes of the enemy, the Gurkha was not simply a soldier. He was a specter, a force of nature that struck without warning, vanishing back into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. To fight the Gurkhas was to face something that no amount of weaponry could defeat, the raw terror of an unstoppable force. As the Japanese garrison in Burma came under attack, they could hear the eerie silence of the Gurkhas before the chaos of battle. The crack of machine guns and the roar of mortar fire seemed trivial compared to the whisper of a kukri. Slicing through the humid air, in the jungle, the knife became the ultimate weapon. Its 14-inch curved blade was more than just steel. It was a symbol of death itself. Fear seeped into the Japanese ranks as the Gurkhas drew closer, their machete-like knives glinting in the dappled sunlight. The British officers who had fought beside the Gurkhas for years understood what their knives represented. Not just a weapon, but a philosophy. For the Gurkha, combat was personal. The knife was an extension of the self, used not only to kill, but to instill fear. A fear that echoed in the hearts of enemies long after the battle had ended. To fall under the strike of a Gurkha's blade was to know you were not just facing a soldier, but a warrior who had fought for centuries under the most brutal conditions, across mountains, through jungles, and in the face of overwhelming odds. The terror of the Gurkha's knife was not merely psychological, it was a tangible, visceral fear. During the jungle campaigns in Burma, Allied officers noted how entire Japanese units would abandon their positions in a panic when they realized they were being stalked by Gurkha troops. Unlike the clumsy and impersonal nature of artillery or machine guns, the Gurkha's approach was intimate. Each victim knew his attacker was close, that the fight would be over before he had time to even raise his weapon in defense. In these jungles, the kukri was the unspoken ruler of death, and where the roar of machine guns failed to intimidate, the sharp hiss of a blade in the night carried the weight of inevitable doom. This fear was ingrained in the Gurkha ethos, nurtured by a tradition that saw battle not as a contest of survival, but as a duty of honor. From a young age, Gurkha recruits were trained to respect their kukri as a sacred extension of their own will. It was said that a Gurkha never lost his kukri, even in death. To surrender his knife was to lose his identity, to become something less than human. Each stroke of the blade was a commitment to the fight, not for territory or political gain, but for the honor of the individual and the regiment in the dense, claustrophobic jungle. This relationship with the knife gave the Gurkhas a terrifying advantage. While the British soldiers fought with rifles and bayonets, the Gurkhas, often lightly armed or with only their blades, would engage in ambush-silent, deadly strikes from the underbrush. The jungle, a place of endless hiding spots and thick foliage, became their domain, a place where the machine gun's thunder was less effective than the silent, deadly cut of a kukri. But the fear instilled by the Gurkha's knives went beyond the mere psychological. Their fighting style was unique. Each slash, each cut, each movement of the blade had been honed through years of tradition. The Gurkha warrior did not simply fight to kill, he fought to destroy. His movements were swift, deliberate, and precise, drawing on centuries of martial discipline. For the Japanese soldiers, trained to expect the direct approach of Western weapons, the sudden, brutal close-quarters combat with the Gurkhas was a nightmare they could not prepare for. The kukri was designed for cutting through both flesh and bone, but it was also a weapon that allowed for a range of deadly techniques: cuts to the throat, slashes to the limbs, and strikes to the head. These were not quick deaths. They were drawn-out, brutal moments of suffering, where the enemy could only gasp for breath before succumbing to the overwhelming force of the blade. Even if a soldier managed to escape the initial strike, he was left with wounds so severe that survival was often a matter of luck, rather than medical care, as the battle raged on through the humid jungle. The Gurkhas, masters of their terrain and their weapon, continued to push the Japanese forces back, leaving behind a trail of terror in their wake. And as each day passed, the Japanese soldiers became more desperate. They had faced European soldiers with guns, but nothing had prepared them for the brutal efficiency of a Gurkha with his kukri. Machine guns, mortars, and grenades had been their weapons of choice in the open fields of war. But in the jungle, in the close quarters of the fight, the Gurkha's knife was their ultimate weapon, something the enemy could not anticipate, could not counter, and could not escape. In the end, the fear of the Gurkha's blade was more powerful than any artillery barrage, more effective than any machine gun's roar. It was the weapon that turned the tide in the jungle, making the Gurkhas an unstoppable force where conventional firepower could not reach. The jungle, with its tangled trees and thick foliage, became the ultimate battleground for the Gurkhas, and their blades a battleground where the machine guns could not follow. But the kukri's deadly edge would reign supreme. But as the Japanese forces retreated, beaten and demoralized, the Gurkhas standing resolute. Their knives gleaming knew they had not just defeated an enemy on the battlefield. They had instilled fear in the very heart of war itself. Fear that no machine gun could match, no artillery could surpass. A fear that would echo through the jungle long after the last battle had been fought. The fear of the Gurkha's blade did not just reverberate through the enemy ranks during the war, it left an indelible mark on the history of jungle warfare itself. As the conflict in Burma and Southeast Asia drew to a close, the world began to reckon with the psychological toll exacted by the Gurkha troops. For the Japanese, the legend of the Gurkha's kukri was not just that of a weapon. It became a mythic force that transcended the actual fighting. The men of the Imperial Japanese Army, once confident in their superiority over the Allied forces, found themselves demoralized by an enemy that fought with an eerie quietness and lethal precision. The Gurkhas had embodied a concept that warfare could not fully understand, a complete fusion of blade and warrior, fear and respect, tradition and death. American and British officers, watching the Gurkhas in action, saw not just soldiers, but living embodiments of a code one rooted in honor, loyalty, and an ancient martial tradition that had survived centuries of war. While the Western military had embraced industrialization and mechanized warfare, the Gurkhas fought as warriors of the past. They had no need for complex tanks or expensive artillery. Instead, they relied on their unparalleled training, honed over generations, and the kukri, a weapon that, though primitive in appearance, was as lethal as any firearm. To understand the true impact of the Gurkha's knife on the battlefield, one must first consider the environment in which they fought. The jungle, with its labyrinthine paths and thick foliage, was a hostile, unpredictable world where conventional combat strategies fell apart. Tanks, armored vehicles, and even machine guns were nearly useless in the dense undergrowth. The Allies quickly realized that to fight in the jungle, they had to adapt their methods. And no one adapted more quickly or more effectively than the Gurkhas, the kukri. While a symbol of fear, was also a tool of survival. Gurkha soldiers would use it not only as a weapon, but as a multi-purpose tool for cutting through the jungle undergrowth, preparing food, and even constructing shelters. The adaptability of the blade mirrored the adaptability of the Gurkha soldier himself. They fought with a ferocity born from necessity, a survival instinct carved into their very being. When faced with the challenge of jungle warfare, the Gurkhas did not just rely on their knives. They became part of the jungle. They learned to move through the dense foliage with stealth, their boots barely making a sound on the wet earth. They were the ghosts of the battlefield, appearing when least expected and disappearing. Just as quickly, the Gurkha's presence was often felt long before it was seen. The Japanese soldiers would hear the whisper of footsteps in the underbrush, the faint crackling of leaves or the soft rustle of bamboo. They would strain their ears, but by the time they realized it was too late, the Gurkha was already there. Some of the most terrifying encounters reported by soldiers in the region involved a sudden, close-quarter ambush by Gurkhas, swift, brutal, and often silent. The psychological impact on the Japanese soldiers was overwhelming. In a war where they had already endured countless hardships and losses, the arrival of Gurkha forces signaled not just a physical defeat, but an emotional one. It shattered their sense of invulnerability. The fear of the Gurkha was not just of death hit, was the fear of being utterly overwhelmed in a way that no other army had done before. There was no front line to hold against the Gurkhas, no artillery bombardment to break their advance. They struck from the shadows, from the very earth itself. The very idea of encountering them was enough to send waves of dread through entire battalions. As the war in Burma progressed, the legend of the Gurkha grew. Japanese soldiers began to speak of them in hushed tones, describing encounters where entire units were driven to the brink of panic by the sight of a Gurkha coming toward them. Kukri in hand, these stories, exaggerated over time, became more than just accounts of individual bravery. They became a symbol of the power of fear and warfare. The knife itself was a metaphor for the unknown, for the unpredictable nature of jungle combat. It was a weapon that could not be easily countered or understood. Its very existence forced an entire army to rethink their approach to war. In the aftermath of the war, as the Allies began to occupy the lands once held by the Axis, the stories of the Gurkhas and their kukris became part of the mythos of the conflict. The Gurkha was no longer just a soldier of the British Empire. He had become a symbol of an ancient form of warfare that transcended the industrialization of modern combat. The kukri had become a symbol of primal power, wielded by men who fought not just for survival, but for an ideal of honor that few could understand. The fear inspired by the Gurkha's knife was not just in the act of killing, but in the psychological warfare that accompanied it. The sound of the blade cutting through the air was enough to unsettle even the bravest soldiers. It was the ultimate weapon of psychological domination, and it was a weapon that proved that. In the dense, unforgiving jungles of Burma, fear could be as powerful as firepower as time passed. The Gurkhas were celebrated as some of the finest soldiers of World War II, but their reputation was not based solely on their skills in battle, or their unflinching courage. It was the aura of terror that surrounded them, the sense that they were not just fighting soldiers, but harbingers of death. The kukri, an instrument of both fear and respect, had ensured that no soldier, whether Allied or Axis, would ever forget the Gurkhas in the jungle war. The legacy of their blade became as much a part of the war's history as any major battle or military strategy. For in the jungle, where technology and firepower failed, the Gurkha's knife had won the battle against the most formidable enemies, and it did so with a simplicity and precision that echoed through history. The Gurkha's knife, in the end, was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of something far greater. It was the embodiment of a soldier's resolve, the distillation of centuries of tradition and survival. In the jungle, where the roar of machine guns was muted by the dense canopy, it was the kukri that stood as the final word in the War of Shadows. It was a weapon that turned the tide in the most brutal theater of World War II, proving that in the darkest places of conflict, where machines could not reach, fear alone could conquer. By the close of the war, the Gurkhas had established themselves as an elite force of unparalleled reputation. Their legacy, however, went far beyond the battlefield. Their presence in the jungles of Burma had not only reshaped tactics and strategies, but had left a profound psychological imprint on the very nature of warfare. What was once considered an invincible military machine had been humbled by men armed with little more than a blade, a symbol of their warrior culture that reached back centuries. Long before the industrialized conflicts of the 20th century, the Gurkhas' contribution, however, was not solely in their fearsome fighting ability. It was their tenacity, their ability to endure, and their bond with their weapon that made them formidable. The kukri was more than a tool of destruction. It was a living symbol of their identity. Gurkhas did not carry it as a weapon alone. They carried it as a part of themselves. Every scratch, every notch in the blade told a story of survival, of campaigns fought and victories won. In a time where mechanization and firepower dominated, the Gurkhas stood as a living testament to the power of individual discipline and the honor of the warrior. While the Allies had leveraged cutting-edge technology to turn the tide of the war, It was the Gurkhas who had fought on their own terms, using their environment to their advantage. They had shown that while modern warfare relied on tanks and artillery, the human element, the unyielding spirit of a soldier, was still the most potent force in combat. Their methods of warfare were not based on numbers or firepower, but on something far more intimate: knowledge of their terrain, the deadly efficiency of their cookery, and a psychological advantage that made their presence almost mythical. What made the Gurkhas even more extraordinary was their connection to the land. They had been brought up in the steep, rugged hills of Nepal, where survival itself was a battle against nature. The jungle, with its oppressive heat and humid air, was merely an extension of the harsh mountains they had known their whole lives. Unlike their foes, who had been raised in cities and towns, the Gurkhas understood that, to survive in war, one had to be as adaptable as the jungle itself. They knew how to move silently through the undergrowth, how to track their enemies without being seen, how to strike without warning and vanish into the trees as if they had never been there. Their mastery of stealth, honed from years of navigating the steep slopes of the Himalayas, became their greatest advantage in the Burmese jungle. The sheer psychological advantage the Gurkhas held over the Japanese soldiers is difficult to overstate. It was not just the blade that made them feared, but their presence itself. The Gurkhas moved with an air of confidence that left no doubt in the minds of their enemies. They had been through worse, survived worse, and were ready to do so again. The Japanese soldiers, who had already suffered tremendous losses and faced overwhelming odds, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed invincible in its quiet determination. The fear of the Gurkhas became so widespread that some units would break before a single shot was fired. Overwhelmed by the certainty of their doom, the psychological toll on the Japanese forces cannot be underestimated. While the Japanese soldiers had been trained for conventional warfare, they were not prepared for an enemy who did not rely on conventional tactics. The Gurkhas fought with an intensity and relentlessness that defied all expectations. They knew how to exploit every weakness, how to turn the very environment against their foes. For the Japanese, who were used to fighting with a sense of honor and discipline, the sudden appearance of a Gurkha silent, deadly, and unyielding was an existential shock. There was no way to anticipate them, no way to prepare for their approach. The jungle was their battlefield, and in it, they were gods. After the war, the legacy of the Gurkhas and their kukris continued to resonate. The stories of their bravery, their skill, and their psychological dominance spread beyond the military. They became legends not just within the British Army but throughout the world. Their status as one of the most elite fighting forces in history was cemented, and their mythos grew, amplified by the stories told by soldiers who had fought beside them and against them. Yet the Gurkhas, with their humble origins and their deep connection to their culture, remained grounded. They did not seek fame or glory. Their identity was tied to their service, to their honor, and to their brothers in arms. The Gurkhas who returned to Nepal after the war carried with them not just memories of battle, but the knowledge that their service had been a tribute to the legacy of their ancestors, men who had fought with the same blade for centuries. In the decades that followed, the Gurkhas would continue to serve in various conflicts around the world, including in the Falklands War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But their reputation was always rooted in their actions during World War II. The kukri, once a simple tool of survival, had become the symbol of their indomitable spirit and their unmatched prowess in combat. It was a blade that not only represented fear, but also the courage to face impossible odds and emerge victorious as time passed. The fear of the Gurkhas' kukri began to fade from the collective memory of the world's armed forces, replaced by the noise of modern warfare drones, automatic rifles, and missiles. But for those who had fought beside or against them in Burma, the image of the Gurkha knife in hand remained a permanent fixture in their minds. It was a reminder that, even in the age of machine guns and tanks, there was still a place for the individual warrior. And the jungle could still be a place where men were judged, not by the weapons they carried, but by the will they held in their hearts. The legacy of the Gurkhas in World War II transcended the battlefield. It became a lesson in how fear could be wielded with precision and purpose. Where artillery could level cities, where machine guns could tear through lines of soldiers, The Gurkha's cookery had instilled fear in ways no modern weapon could. It was a weapon that spoke of tradition, of honor, and of a warrior's spirit that could not be broken by technology. For in the jungle, where the roar of machines failed, the whisper of a blade was all that was needed to claim victory.